Just let me know too.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. We're doing great. Feel curious.
I'm sitting in front of this, I'm sure.
Oh wait, it's reserved. Here, so about the corner.
No, I'll sit.
As opposed to yesterday.
Oh my God, yes. That was a surprise. I know, yeah. She saw me. I saw you with his dad.
Just a little bit. Some anchors take with you, okay? Yeah, so we'll keep you there.
Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? So, first I want to say thank you all for your patience while we were working through a couple of last-minute technical problems. So I will try to make my welcome a little bit more brief, just to kind of make up for time. Nobody start applauding too loudly at that. So my name is Chris Doyle. I'm the head of education for the New Mexico Museum of Art, and I want to welcome everybody here this morning for 50 years of 7 families, the legacy of Rick Dillingham and Pueblo Pottery. Now, just in case anybody isn't aware, this is related to a show that we currently have up in the new wing, To Make, Unmake, and Make Again. So if anybody hasn't gone to see the show, which I would be a little surprised if anybody really hasn't yet, but if you haven't, we'd love to have you come and check out the show afterwards. A couple of quick housekeeping things. If anybody has a cell phone, and I realize I haven't checked mine, so hopefully I don't use my cell phone in just a moment, please make sure that that is on silent, just for the comfort of everybody If anybody is curious about something that is said during the course of the talk, and you want to come back and revisit it, we are recording this, and it will be available on the museum's YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the week. And we are live streaming, so everybody who's joining us from other parts of the state, welcome. We're glad you could join us this morning. Let's see. So with that, my job this morning is to introduce Katie Doyle. Katie is our assistant curator and the curator of the current Rick Dillingham show, Make It Make Again. So this is actually was Katie's first show that she solo curated since joining the museum. Person who was told Katie she may have set the bar a little high, right off the bat. So one of the things that has been really wonderful about this show has kind of developed. The staff here, so folks like me, we've had kind of the pleasure of seeing this show come about in a lot of different ways as Katie has investigated Rick, his work, his life, and we've been able to kind of take this really wonderful journey with her that has culminated in the show that's up and moving right now. So. With that, like I said, I was going to be brief, so I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Hi folks, good morning, welcome. Thank you all for being here. Before I begin, I would like to open up our program with a land acknowledgement. So the New Mexico Museum of Art is on the unceded ancestral land of the Tewa people. Ogapoge, White Shell Water Place, is the name of the land that we now call Santa Fe. We honor and acknowledge the sovereignty of the 19 Pueblos, the Fort Sill Apache tribe, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Mescalero Apache tribe, and the Navajo Nation, all on whose ancestral lines New Mexico's boundaries have been drawn. As a cultural institution, it's our duty to unravel this history through stewardship to the arts, and in doing so, to honor the original stewards of the land we occupy. So before I begin introducing folks, we are missing someone from our panel today, Clarence Cruz, indigenous potter, and he's ill and unfortunately unable to make it, so he sends his regrets and his hellos from his home, and the comfort of his own home. All that said, I'm Katie Doyle. Hi. And to my left, I'll start just kind of going left to right, is Garth Clark, noted historian and art critic in the field of ceramics. McChesney, who is the curator at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology and also curating the 50-year retrospective exhibition at the Maxwell Museum, which is slated to open August. Next year?
This August, yeah.
Next August. Yes. And Bruce Bernstein, PhD and former head of the School of American Research. Former? Current?
No, not School of American Research. Maya.
Maya. Hi, Maya. Hello. Good morning. I knew I would mess something up right out the chute, so hi, hello. This is what this is going to be. So we're all very excited to be here and discuss the story of Rick Dillingham and his relationship with indigenous nations across the state of New Mexico and beyond. So, how do we begin? Is the main question. We all got together prior to this discussion to kind of talk because for me, when I first saw Rick's work, I had a very visceral and averse reaction to it. I wasn't sure how it made me feel because I knew that he had worked with indigenous people and I could see that in his work, and it led me to question maybe some of his methods of making, some of his decisions and form. And the more I dug into his relationships with indigenous people, the more I kind of uncovered this beautiful depth of affection and community and craft. So those are really like the big three that we all discussed too in our conversation prior to this program. So I guess I would like to begin by a person like Mr. Dillingham, who is both a ceramist and a non-native person making ceramics with indigenous people. How are these specifically their own silos? And how does this converge with the time period of the 1970s? The time, the place, and the craft. If anyone wants to jump in. Big question. Yes, a big question. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome, friends of Rick. Any one of you could be sitting up here instead of me, and I know that each one of you is going to weigh what we say and think, how about this? We didn't say this or that. And I think that is the story of Rick Dillingham, that he filled so many of our lives in so many ways. So my focus on Rick for the panel is very narrow, happens to be about the Seven Families book and Pueblo Pottery's relation to the potters. And I'm sorry we don't have a Pueblo person up here as a potter to talk about his influence, which was extraordinary. So Rick as a potter, explored pottery. He went to University of New Mexico, and Pueblo Pottery is every place. It couldn't not have influenced him in some way. And I think as a potter, as well as a ceramicist, when he worked with people at Hopi and here in the Taylor Pueblos and Coaching, he actually worked with people, mixing the clay, firing, building, firing, did all those things, and had suggestions at times to make pottery a little differently, and at other times he was given suggestions. Obviously, he was very influenced by the people that he was working with. That could be your question. More
Yeah. And obviously, I feel like there's a lot that we can get into, so it doesn't necessarily have to be question and answer. If there's anything you would like to build and expand upon.
Well, I think that, you know, today we talk about appropriation. We hear that a lot in terms of the ontologies or knowledge that exist in Pueblo cultures and societies ongoing, and they share very generously through the pottery. So we think about appropriation, and we do look around Santa Fe, we see all the stores selling very much appropriated things made elsewhere in the world, not here. But I don't think it was really, I don't think anyone ever thought Rick's work was appropriated in any way. I've never heard that from any potter. Only remembering him in the most fond, personal ways, and being very helpful in their career and helping them sort of get on to a place with that career. So I think the appropriation word, which Katie wrote down here on the sheet someplace, which is a big issue for us, we can rethink Rick and turn him into that individual, but I don't think that's fair. I think that we're all people of the times in which we live and act, and he very much is. I think it might be slightly different today. But potters still demonstrate, they still show people, they still have people working with them at their kitchen tables and trying things out. So it's not that different of a time, but I think in the broader scholarly world, people talk about something, but I think in the reality of working with, you know, sharing, generous potters and so forth, it's still very much the world in which Rick experienced Pueblo societies and people.
I mean, yeah, I feel like you're kind of working on recontextualizing the time of that Seven Families exhibition with the work that you're doing on this retrospective.
Right. Obviously, thank you all for coming, and I'm delighted to be here and be part of this conversation today. I want to talk about how I met and came to know Rick, and then, which I didn't know him well. Others here knew Rick much better than I. But his work very much influenced things that I were looking at as a very novice, fledgling cultural anthropologist, museum person. And having worked with an historic museum collection in the East, and then come out to find out what was going on with pottery in the then 1990s, and I worked principally at Hopi. But I also dealt a lot with the question of representation, because what I had learned in the community was very different from how the material was represented in the marketplace. And while I did meet and talk to Rick and see his collection, I didn't really know the depth of his familiarity with Pueblo families or his ceramic work. But I think when Rick first started, it was a very interesting time when he was at UNM, and not just for him as an aspiring ceramist, but in the art world, because ceramics and textiles actually were not recognized really as art forms, or at least they were marginalized. Photography was as well, and then Native American art was, and these sort of all came up together in the art world and gained greater legitimacy late in the 20th century. So Rick was active in a really pivotal time. And part of the recontextualization that we're doing in our exhibit through co-collaboration with artists from, what are the numbers here? I think it's 18 Pueblos, including Kobe and his Isla del Sur, and 24 artists who are the co-curators in this. We are foregrounding the community perspective. My own understanding was that so much was lost in translation, if you will, as pots left the community, entered into the market, and then became represented through conventions of the Western art world. And Rick's work was, I think, embedded in that, though I don't think his selection of 7 families was the families with whom he worked closely and he had very deep relationships with. But that came to be a selection that governed the marketplace and how people collected, and came to really sort of establish a canon, when in fact there were also communities that weren't recognized, that also had that depth of practice in the community. So we're trying to recover that in the collections of the Maxwell Museum. And one thing about the 7 Families exhibit is there's very little of Maxwell's permanent collection that was included in it. In this case, we are really featuring the pieces from our collection, which the artists have selected. And that's been a lot of fun, actually. It's been really great. And it kind of amplifies or broadens, I think, the perspective. But
I think that's really something to telling the story on your own terms. A lot of joy, you know, that can come from that, reflecting on the history of what this exhibition was, and continues to be, and also while at the same time redefining it in this moment right now.
Exactly. I think that's an important consideration. It's a different context as well, and artists have a different kind of agency that many did not have. But I really appreciate what I've learned from this exhibit, from your work, about Rick and from our members as well.
Well, you said something about the time of the 1970s as well, and I feel like that's also like a perfect opportunity for you to speak a little bit, because the 1970s was like a wild time, culturally and also in the craft community. If you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it was different in that a lot of activities that crossed between cultures were seen as innocent. You know, depending upon how the person became involved with it, to what extent they were exploiting and copying it, but it wasn't an instant cancellation if you cross that line. I think Rick would have had a very difficult time with the same work in today's community. The right or wrong of that is not really important. Like many, I don't see his work as any form of copying or exploitation. I might add that aside from myself, Rick was the most arrogant person I know. Can you write that down? I want that inscribed in stone. I think it already is somewhere. And the most compassionate, not an unusual combination for a very theatrical gay man. And so we met him through Beatrice's work, and Julia Myers is sitting there. She was Rick's manager for his career, and is also one of the greatest Beatrice Wood fans in existence. Beatrice Wood sort of came out of the Dada movement. She supposedly did or didn't sleep with Marcel Duchamp. And I was crude enough, but you know, I'm a gay man, so I can cross gender lines that straight men would never dare. And I said to Beatrice, what was it like sleeping with Duchamp? And she said, like shaking hands. I asked what she meant, and she said, he didn't look upon sex as a personal act. It was a body function. Friendship was where it was for him. And Beatrice met him when she was 21, about there, and stayed friends throughout his life. Well, Rick comes into this because he publishes her autobiography, The Sharpness, which was an enormous success. It was taken over eventually by Chronicle Press, and has been very, very successful. So we sort of noticed him on that. I would say that perhaps in the beginning we were not actually dismissive of Rick, but a little cautious because of the native pottery context. And that was used amongst people who were sort of frightened or jealous of him as a counterpoint. Even then, I mean, it's not the way it is now, but even then it was. And then, of course, as you get to know the work, you realize that you are looking at a starting point. And I think the extraordinary thing that happened to Rick, the gas cans I grew to love. I hated the gas cans. It was so easy to fall in love with these bulbs, volumes, and the gas cans were brilliant. They evoked the early Western boundary with not doing anything sort of too literal or too cowboy. And but then he began to, having worked in your institution, putting pieces together, began to work with shards. And what happened was he discovered the language. It wasn't merely that he wrote parts and put them together again, rather that's a great achievement. But he began to realize that playing with these elements was a way of speaking visually. The placement of this one next to that one said something that neither would have said if they were not in proximity to each other. So the work began to evolve, and also what you begin to realize is that, yes, the influence of many of the pieces is clearly native, but it's also Negro. And it's a number of contemporary artists that he was well aware of, not very deliberately, but he said he would find in a native piece a connection to contemporary art, and it would change the way he would paint, the colors he would use. So step by step he began to evolve himself in a way, and that was, when we started working with him, that was a concern. He worried that because as this hydra-headed being, scholar, writer, collector, diva, all the rest of it, he was worried that all of those things he was going to lose his credibility as an artist, that he'd be remembered as a scholar of native work, but not as Rick Dillingham, the artist. And so that, in essence, I think, was the foundation for our relationship. We showed him in New York and Los Angeles from 1987 until shortly before his death. And he spoke towards the end of giving up dealing because he felt that the time had come for him to really make his mark as an artist. I've already said he's arrogant. I could have added he was paranoid. And Rick was upset by anybody who used a sharp piece in their work. He would rail about it because, in a way, he felt that he had developed this language, it was his language, and we would speak to him talking down his elbow of people who used the sharps for a long time. But we found it easy to work with. I'm sure you've had all kinds of experiences, but easy to work with, provided you took him seriously and treated him with respect. He was had a great sense of himself and where he belonged. We had many exciting moments in handling his work, but perhaps the most thrilling, in a way, because it opened up something in my mind which had not been there before. And that was his collectors of his, Charles Diker. It was his birthday, I believe, but don't hold me to that. And the Dikers decided to give him a birthday party. The Dikers floors through apartment in one of the big apartment buildings opposite the Met. So this event for 150 people seated formally for dinner was done in their own ballroom. So, you think of Rick spending his time out in the desert, was also very connected in another world, and you can tell by that event deeply respected. And what was really so sensational about that night was that the hosts brought together two events. One was his birthday, the other was, it was the anniversary of Crystal Night. And so that was kind of maybe a sort of dangerous way to go, but these smashed pots and smashed bones. And so I remember thinking, and like many of those questions we don't ask artists while they're alive, I wonder to what extent he believed in, or was expressing in the breaking of the pots, which is an act of violence. The violence that was directed against the native culture as well. And that there was actually a sort of a very profound reasoning, but that is all
just a contradiction.
Well, and you had said, oh, so sorry.
No, that's great.
Yeah, I feel like that's spicy. You had mentioned something about language, and I feel like you and I got to the same place, more or less. I was thinking about language and the act of translation. When you're piecing these things together, you know, that he would break and piece his own work together, and then breaking and bringing things back during this very intense period in the United States where people are reclaiming their identity, reclaiming their culture, and the act of translation, the act of piecing things together, and how that is also related to, you know, the kill hole, to these other things that are part of indigenous tradition. Bruce, I'm just adding. Go ahead, Bruce.
No, you did a great job. Thanks, Kate. Well, I'm very interested in the impact that Rick had and how his life still lives on the Pueblo Pottery side. I can't do the ceramic side like you did. Thank you, Garth, for what you said about that. But this impact on the pottery side is really still here in many ways. Now, the 1960s and 70s were a very different time, and you probably would not recognize Santa Fe. It was a great ski resort town for about 3 months a year, and pretty much it had the same structure as it had in the 20s. It was very small, just maybe about 12,000 people. It hadn't grown a great deal, maybe 15,000, I'm sorry. An Indian market was not the primary place that people found native arts. It was Albuquerque tribal. And so Santa Fe really wasn't what we think about it today. And so Rick had a very different interest. The other thing about that time period that extended for another couple decades was being in contact with native people. People maybe had phones, or maybe there was a phone in one family member's house. There were party lines to these small communities. So it was, or you wrote letters, or you visited people. So it was kind of difficult. You had to really be there with people to visit with them, and then you knocked on the door, and they said, oh, just come by in the morning, I'll be home. You knock on the door, and they got busy with something else, so they're not home. That still happens, by the way. But now today, we're spoiled, right? First the appearance of business cards. Everybody got a business card, so on all the tables in Indian market, let's say, there's now a business card. And then people started getting phones. I mean, incredibly started getting phones in the sense that sitting in a booth all night at Indian market in the early 2000s, people were waiting for Roxanne Swetzel to come. And they had a full report of what Roxanne was bringing because they were tracking her on the highway with her phone and calling her and asking her questions. I mean, it's sort of this incredible change from just, let's say, 30 or 40 years previous to that. So Rick steps into that, and he creates an accessibility about potters that people had not really had. The scholarship that surrounded Pueblo Pottery in 1970 was pretty much at the end of what it had been for most of the 20th century. And you can see that scholarship where Rick kind of takes the catalog cards, particularly for the Indian Arts Fund. He classified things by what he thought of Pueblo's particular pottery should look like. All black pottery should come from only 2 Pueblos, 2 Tewa Pueblos, I should say. It came from all 6 Tewa Pueblos. Things that now we're looking at and reinvestigating and beginning to have a much better understanding, looking at potters' names and so forth, not just these matriarchs, but looking at all the other people working and readjusting these kinship tables that are here and putting other people on top of those kinship tables. But I think to create 7 families at that particular time was quite an accomplishment. And he did it also in an era where the pottery experts were mostly came from the archaeology side. And that archaeology side is expressed in the Indian Arts Fund. That's another day we'll talk about, just take my word on that. But the way that it's organized, the way it was cared for, you only took what you could see. So you only described the pot and what you could see. You never described in the catalog record, for example, that I went to Teresita and I asked Teresita about the piece, and this is what she said. So you can imagine the sort of stirring of people's so-called scholarship that Rick was saying, hey, we're going to invite these 7 families over, we're going to do this exhibit, they're all going to come to the opening, and this is going to be different. And like we were talking about with Rick, chatty and wonderful and maybe arrogant, but just being so welcoming and so present and just bringing things together like that. So the 7 families did that. Now I don't think the 7 families, the impact of the 7 families, to me at least in my work and investigating and talking to Rick over the years, it took him a long time to do 14 families. It took him a long, long time. Now I've not thought of he wanted to be a ceramicist, he didn't want to do another book on Pueblo Pottery. I have to say that. But our conversation focused on Rick saying, I don't want to do another book about this. And our conversation then focused on why he didn't want to do a book. And basically, he said to me, 7 families has become a shopping list. And what he means by that is these kinships. You had up the Nampeo family.
You want to switch back?
Yeah, you go back to Nampeo.
Go back.
So there's a Nampeo.
Yeah.
There's a
People
Nampeo.
were in 1994, so it's the 7 families on the left and 14 families on the right.
That's correct. That's right. And so you can see the explosion. It doesn't mean that there weren't this many people in that Nampeo family before 1994. It just means that people now identify themselves as grandchild, nephew, and all the different things we hear today, great-great-granddaughter, and so forth, all the things we hear today. So people harken back to the 1974 book in terms of chasing their ancestry. People started saying, I want a pot from so-and-so, and literally check that off on the charts, you know. And that really bothered Rick, that people weren't looking at the pot and decided they liked it. They were looking at the book and decided they should buy it. And Rick felt that was probably insulting in some way. So what happened then with the marketplace in general is people kept making pottery that was very much like the last pot because they were selling to people that really desired to have pottery like they were supposed to make, as defined by the marketplace. But
Supposed to make.
supposed to be. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did not do that.
The little hair,
I didn't
hair
know I was supposed
bunnies.
to do that.
Yeah.
I thought the pause did that.
That's fine, that's fine.
And that has carried on throughout the marketplace for a long time. And if you have a maverick in the marketplace that comes up, like a Jody Falwell from Santa Clara, she's not making red and black pottery, but she's doing something different. She's using sgraffito. She's writing words and politics and caring for dogs and things about her family, her life. She's making figures that aren't membrous or Pueblo iconography, like the Vietnam Peninsula, the Southeast Asia, Reagan, and on and on and on, all these different things that she did. People looked askance at a potter like that. And so when she comes in 1984, which is not very long ago, she comes in with this pot, it's green. And the conversation in the judging room is basically split between 2 parties. One party saying, Pueblo pottery is never green, I can't sell a green pot. The other half of the room basically saying, I'm so happy, I don't want to see another black pot. So the outcome of 7 families begins to fray with people like Jody coming in and being a real maverick. Jody's family is not in 7 families. She's not, and she's always felt that pressure of not being at Tafoya. And so Rick was very reluctant about that book and really kept putting it off, I think, to the end of his life where he felt that he really had an obligation to finish it. I'll tell you one more thing I just wanted to say. Rick is troublemaker. Okay? So Rick worked on the opening of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, and they wrote a book called I Am Here, and Rick wrote the chapter about pottery. And in that chapter, he took the last gigantic storage pot that Maria and Julie Martinez worked on together in 1942 that won a prize at that year's Indian market. He took that pot and he put a caption underneath it. And he talked about it. He said that Margaret Tafoya made the pot and brought it to San Alfonso where Maria and Julie had painted it. So I was in the museum where I was working, and Anita Martinez, Maria Day, Anita Day walked in, her daughter-in-law, and she was very tearful and said, I don't understand why Rick wrote this. It's not true that my parents, Maria and Julian, worked together in the kitchen. And I remember it so much because it was my first winter in the house. She was moving into a house with these rock stars in the pottery world, and she was very, very nervous of being in that house. And she said, Maria got $40 from Dead Doll, the dry goods merchant on the plaza, and 3 shawls. She gave 1 shawl to her daughter-in-law, Santana. She kept one for herself, and she gave me the 3rd shawl, and I still have it. So I went to Rick, and I said, why did you put that in there? Anita came and talked to me, and he said, oh, I just wanted to stir things up a little bit. So anyways, that was Rick's troublemaker at the time.
There are a couple of things here that I wanted to maybe elaborate on, but I will say the image on the screen right now I think is fabulous. I read that as not as Maria critiquing Rick's work, and I think that's a really important component, something I have learned through this larger conversation that we've had, and learning that we had interests, but from different perspectives on Pueblo Pottery and Rick Dillingham's role in how that developed. So that, in my mind, brings up, again, the question of appropriation. But I think perhaps turning the perspective to understand because for indigenous people, appropriation has been an ongoing concern and really goes to the question of authority and ultimately to the question of sovereignty, who has the authority to define the meaning, the value of this work. But I think on some level that Rick internalized perspectives that he learned from the community and didn't present them as anything other than his own. And so his own work, but he was drawing on his indigenous instructors, his indigenous elders, if you will, as almost as strongly as from an academic context, art world context. And I think that was very rare in the time, and I also think that it's not something that could be recognized or accepted in a sort of formal way, certainly in academia these days. And this is an important difference from 7 families up to whatever, here we are 50 years later, that really the authority is clearly in the hands of the makers, of the artists, to define the work and to convey its value. Part of its value, I think, is also that pottery is a language from community perspectives. It's an embodied language, and I'm most familiar with Hopi pottery, and especially the importance of the blush as a permanent feature of the body, and that is an expression. It's that autonomous being's expression of its own health and beauty and capacity to bring forth, to manifest these cultural ideals, aspirations that are so critical in the Hopi world. The issue about so I think there's a difference between kinship and genealogy, and that is one of the critiques I've made of the genealogies in 714 families. Genealogies they actually misrepresent kinship. That they don't represent the kinship systems, as anthropologists once upon a time would call them, in a given community, but they also don't represent the on-the-ground interactions that Bruce just described so well, and that are also a part of how pottery has developed, which we're learning wonderful things about, the interactions, the movements across pueblos. Bruce's comment of, don't want to see any more black pots. There's a lot of innovation and a lot of regeneration that has occurred historically through the interactions, the intermarriages, the travel seasonally and staying in a community for a period of months and then returning home, and then, it's a very active, very dynamic process that has in some respects been kind of, shrouded in, if you will, or contained by some of the categories that we have established for pottery and all kinds of native work. But the Nampeo name in particular became a brand, as did Martinez. But Nampeo, that was well prior to when Rick was doing his work and did a Nampeo genealogy. That marking, branding by name was through the Fred Harvey Company at Hobie House in the Grand Canyon, and he basically put stickers made by Nampeo Hobie on the bottom of those vessels. But that idea of branding has been, I think, very, very strong in the marketplace and art world context. So I'm going to characterize Rick in a different way. He's just arrogant, he's a troublemaker. Rick was also, and here I am in the middle, right? Rick was also a mediator, and he did translate, and I saw this happen at Indian Market in, I think it's 91, at Mark Tabo's booth. And Mark Tabo was making plainware. And that was before we would know Bruce outlawing the hill when, sure exactly when.
Not the same. 91 Best of Pottery.
Quick question.
Yeah.
For those who don't know,
Yeah.
could we define blush and could we define
Sure.
plainware?
Sure. Well, since I raised the question of blush, in Hobie pottery, and there are a couple of examples in the exhibit, you see that the body of the pot, the color of the body of the pot is variable. In some cases, it's deeper, could be an orange. In other cases, it's lighter. Sometimes it's a cream color, and sometimes it's more of a rose color. And that, the deep sort of orangey color is kind of a deep blush. And potters will often say, oh, look at that blush, that's a wonderful blush. And that has to do with the kind of clay they use, and how they fire, and the context of the environment in which they're firing, and how much wind there is. So it has to do with the fuel source and the intensity of the heat in particular areas, and that's variable when you ground fire. And so that variability in color is a very important aesthetic feature of the pot. And you don't get that when you use red clay that fires yellow clay that fires red. So, and so it's a human sensation, right? You blush, it's an emotional response. But in humans, it's fleeting. But typically it's your face that blushes, and that's something that is readily apparent. You're communicating something in an embodied way. You're not speaking about the vitality of that, again, not that viable social being, pots are social beings, and it's a way of articulating something that Hopi's value, that emotional connection, is very important. Planeware is just not painted. Or you want to elaborate on that, Bruce? That's a primary distinction for the Hopi pots. And we've often focused on the painted surface, if you will, but the pots are three-dimensional, and they have voices, and they have, they move through space, and then the painted surface is another language, another kind of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, the planeware is sometimes called by the archaeological term utilitarian. Utilitarian means to archaeologists, it used to mean archaeology is changing. It's of no utility to archaeologists because they can't date it, it's not painted. So a lot of the planeware that archaeologists have dug up over the decades is actually buried in the backs of museums and not really looked at in terms of things. Today people can distinguish between dating and types of planeware. So planeware itself was thought to be a non-entry in Indian market as well. And so when Lonnie Bay Hill showed up with this gorgeous micaceous clay with blushes or fire marks on it, very personal, something that had been part of the Tewa community for hundreds and hundreds of years, with a very widespread use of pottery. It was about half of every household was this micaceous ware. And Lonnie shows up with this pot, and nobody told him, is not initiated by anyone except Lonnie and his family, and his understanding of what pottery looked like in his pueblo and the other Tewa pueblos. He puts the pot down for judging, and the same thing that happened with Jody Falwell's pottery happened with Lonnie's pottery. I can't sell a non-painted pottery. It's not Pueblo pottery because it's not painted. And fortunately, Lonnie really prevailed. He won best of classification for pottery. I think it's 91. In 2002, won best of show with another beautiful micaceous pot. And between Lonnie's putting that pot in the market, there were other unpainted wares in market at that time, but they were undistinguished within market, let's just say. But by winning a prize like that, between 91 and 2002, there's 300 micaceous clay artists working. So it has a huge impact as far as the marketplace goes. Thank goodness for potters who change the marketplace continually.
Well, and I just, on the interaction there with Rick and Mark Tabo, I think that Mark had won a prize of some sort, I don't recall exactly what it was, at that market, and I know that there were people lining up at his booth early in the morning. He had his ribbons on his booth there, but he had this, besides his painted work, which I will say, we also dichotomize between what's artistic, what's utilitarian. They can't be, it's one or the other, and we focused on the painted surface as a definition, as a way of defining the work as aesthetic according to Western conventions. But there was Rick there at Mark's booth too, and there was a collector or a buyer who Rick was mediating between Mark and the collector about the value of a piece, so that he explained that utilitarian wares have their own set of features, and that they're, and this is a piece worth buying, worth collecting. It is also aesthetic. I think that's really interesting from the perspective of the work that Rick did, and a lot of reconstructed big pieces are planewares, but also, he did a lot of work that with various kinds of firing techniques that were integral to the aesthetic quality of the pot. So he understood that, and I think this is really important too, that Rick understood the, the medium, obviously, and they shared a connection. There was a kind of kinship, a different kind of kinship, but there was and that's, I could go on here, that's what's important from, about the significance of pottery in Pueblo communities. It establishes and reinforces, and times across historical times, it regenerates these wonderful historical connections among people. That's really an important part of the kinship. And so those of us who really like pottery, we're sort of in the kinship circle as well, the kinship connection.
Well, and I want to add too, in the process of putting this exhibition together, I spent a lot of time in the storage vault in Mayak, going through Dillingham's personal collection of pots, which he bequeathed in part to the School of American Research and then another portion to Mayak. And I only went through a fraction of what they had, but I got a very interesting sense of his taste. And he really loved weird stuff. He really, the things that I noticed about his collection were that, he loves the moment of blush. He also loves the micaceous plainware. There are stories that I've heard from people that Rick knew about him cooking in his own micaceous ware. So he would use the things that he had in addition to enjoying them visually. But he also really loved things that were different. A number of like bright blue Pueblo pots in that collection that I don't think I've ever seen before. And a lot of those like goofy dinosaur pots that you see kids decorating. And just things that are a little strange and unusual and off the beaten path. And I could tell that, as that kinship component coming back into play, where he could see and appreciate and enjoy the tradition and have a close relationship with these families and these matriarchs. But at the same time, he was very interested in the forward progression of Pueblo pottery as an art form. And Garth, if you would like to speak a little bit about that, because as we've been talking about micaceous pottery, I've also been thinking about Christina Course.
Yes. Well, to expand on something Bruce said about pots being brought in, and if they sold, and they take them again, if they didn't. So it was very different to the way, for instance, we ran our gallery. Some of our artists, like Ken Ferguson and others, we showed for 5 years before there was any commercial traction. So they'd have a show, very little would sell, and they'd come back with the show they wanted after that. And so the artists felt that they were not controlled by the marketplace, by the success or failure of it. But with native potters, there's that thing called the rent bowl. You should never buy a rent bowl. That is the bowl that is made like 3 days before the rent is due, and they come in with the rent bowl. But there was that kind of closeness. They would make things, bring them in, sell them, and they would sell them to dealers. Dealers in turn would not, and this is not a generalization, there were exceptions, but dealers would follow the taste of the collectors. So the collectors didn't like fire clouds. The collectors didn't like any color going beyond the black outline. The collectors didn't like this, collectors didn't like that. So when, the Diegos and Nathan Gaze and various others came in with their work, which was much more iconoclastic, they often found rejection for their work because it was not on that list that the collectors wanted to buy. And I can understand Rick's frustration with his writing, because what it does with a book like Seven Families is it gets people to want to collect yesterday. And now you think about that, the influence on a native ceramic artist is really pretty intense. They're not going to have someone support them for 5 years while you're trying to get someone to understand that the artist is indeed as brilliant as you think they are. And that was a real ceiling. Now, not entirely, there were exceptions. And so I did a book called Free Spirit, and thank you very much for all the help you gave me on that. But you don't take any of the blame. In fact, you know, Charles King said to me after the book was published, he said, "You're really coming to Santa Fe without a bodyguard." And it dealt with some of these issues, some of the things about being in a tourist trade that blunted the creative freedom. And in doing that, I got to meet one of the most terrifying people I've ever met in my whole life, which was Nathan McChesney. An amazing man, but totally unpredictable. And really, you didn't know what he was going to do next. We went to Chocolate Maven to have lunch with him, and when he saw us come in, he got onto the table, took his very, very thin shorts, and hiked them up so that almost no mystery was left. We handed on some table. So I started visiting with him when he got a pit bull, because how could you trust a pit bull that he owned?
I love my pit bulls.
I love pit bulls, but I didn't trust his. So I spoke to him about Rick. Now, the show 5, the book in show 5, Free Spirits, was, the exhibition was exceptional, one of the most beautiful shows I've seen, as is yours. And it was done in Hollywood. It was a great event. Just a slight digression, and they had a conference, so everybody came out, except Nathan, which was a huge relief. Virgil, wonderful Virgil, stands up to speak, and there are all these very serious Dutch people sitting there listening. They have a great love for indigenous art and respect for those artists and everything, so they were taking it very seriously. And Virgil got to the pedestal and said, "Leave fly here on big flying He then went on to explain that, you know, the romanticizing of his culture is not something that he finds particularly charming. But anyway, speaking to Nathan, who was a genius, by the way, really a genius. Some of his works are sort of just take your breath away. So I said to him, "Okay, what about Rick?" And he said, "Rick and I met the first time And I told him I was a ceramist, and I told him that I was Hopi, Tiwa, and Navajo. And he said, which mesa? And he said, third mesa. And Rick said, oh, please. He said, I don't know anything outside the first mesa. So then I discovered a blog somewhere that sort of questioned whether this had actually happened. Actually, they didn't question whether it had happened. They assumed that I was speaking honestly, but they said, it sounds like he was trying to razz an Anglo art dealer. But I think there was an element of truth in that. Rick would be incredibly brutal at times. And, but the interesting thing is, if you look back now, and you look for influence of Rick in the later work, his love child is Nathan Gay. Both gay men, both extraordinary iconoclasts in their own way. His work based on shard structure is really exceptional. It is form-wise, I don't want to say more sophisticated because that sounds judgmental, which I don't want it to be, but more complex forms, beautifully organized, beautifully painted, and nothing like Rick's form. So I don't know, maybe some of you in the audience know others who took on Rick, but definitely he had a very big influence on at least part of Nathan Gay's image.
It is 12:09. I have to be the bad guy and keep time today, but we said we were going to save the last 20 minutes for questions. Who's got questions? I feel like we could keep talking, we could keep going. You know, this is a conversation that was even prior to our first discussion. It was very deep and also circular. You know, we just keep going. But we're very interested in hearing from you.
Did you said you found clay dinosaurs in Rick's collection?
Yeah. So there's a tradition of adults making the pot. If I'm
Were there
correct in
other
estimating.
animal forms that he collected?
Where?
Were there other animal forms he collected?
I did not look at many of the animal forms, but I know that they exist, and I know, Bruce, you helped steward that gift.
Yeah, so the idea of making human and animal forms was widespread throughout the Pueblo villages, and through the work of scholarship in the early 20th century, it was decided they were not authentic forms, but influenced by Spanish, therefore not eligible to be in what was called Indian fare at the time, or to be sold in the stores. So people ceased making them. But there was still a little bit of that going on. The pieces that Katie's referring to are probably Cochiti. Rick split his gift by villages between the SAR and Mayak. And in the Acoma material that he had is at SAR, and included in that are greenware ceramic cats. And they were vehemently opposed to taking those pieces because they weren't native, because they were ceramic and then painted and probably fired in an oven someplace, or at least a kiln. And Rick not only insisted they take them, but moved them to the front of the shelf where people could see them, but they're now in the middle of the top where you can't see them any longer. But they're part of the authentic repertoire for Acoma people, just like animals in all the different villages are authentic. So Rick, again, trying to push away from generalities about pottery, looking for the unusual things, I think very much trying to do that, and really being attracted to potters that were really iconoclasts or individuals, like a Nathan, who was very complicated, but a wonderful potter, brilliant potter, but complicated to work with and to even have a conversation with at certain times. So I think Rick was always looking to put something in a collection that would stick out. I think was part of his work, for the contemporary side, I should say.
I remember this corn cob from like a VHS, like this really big corn cob like laying on its side that was part of his bequest, probably the SAR. I saw it in a VHS in our archive somewhere, and I wonder what happened to that, because I didn't see it at my house. But
Well, a lot of people, Christine made lots of corn in her work all the time. I'm not sure exactly which piece you're going to. So.
find it. I'm gonna send you a
Okay,
screenshot because it boggled me. I loved it.
So, all three of you knew Rick, Mr. Dillingham, and so do you feel that you asked him the questions and got to know him in ways that are satisfying to you? Or like, you know, talking to a parent, there's always like one last question you wish you would have asked them. That's a question.
I have to say that I didn't know Rick well when he was alive. And I have come to appreciate him differently, to really appreciate him at this stage, in part because, you know, you supposedly develop wisdom as you mature. So my own perspective is different, but it's also that I appreciate what I have learned and am learning from others who knew him well, and from his work, and also from the knowledge that I've gained over the years of pottery in its context of origin, and as I've gotten to know more potters well, and had the pleasure of working with them. So, also I'll just say that I first came out to New Mexico. My roots are in the East, but it turns out I found I had some family who were out here at one point in time, in 1974. So this is all very, you know, it's kind of a touchstone for me as well, but you know, it's also, well, how did we get to 50 years, you know, which is where we are now. So it's especially interesting to know that, you know, he was a young artist, scholar, you know, at the time that he did this exhibit, and that it was very influential. And I might just say, you might have seen in a slide, there were a couple photo permissions from potters to be photographed for the exhibition, and the catalog, and it was signed by Rick. That was a Maxwell, very, you know, what they used to do wasn't Xerox, it was a mimeograph.
Wow. Throwback.
So, but you can see that on the left, it's signed by Rachel Dominga for her mother, Priscilla Dominga. And I included that because Rachel is really, who is unfortunately gone now, but she was very influential. You know, the impetus for doing something that relates to Seven Families at the Maxwell Museum first came from Rachel. She came to the museum, and she was selling some work. I had visited with her and her mother, Priscilla, and learned some absolutely wonderful things about Nampeyo, really important insights. And she said that she was included in Seven Families, and she said, you know, that exhibition was very important for her generation, who they were just, you know, starting into pottery and selling pottery at the time. And was there a way to mark the fact that, you know, that she and other potters in the community were very grateful for the museum to do that, and wondered if there was some way now we could do something. Well, that was actually pre-COVID, and I didn't have space for it until post-COVID, and after she had passed, unfortunately. But I did have, when I started to think about it, okay, it was sort of like, okay, there was 7 families, and then 14 families 20 years later, and now it's, oh my, it's 30 years after that, and oh my, that means we're at 50 years. So it made sense, you know, to do that, but I want to acknowledge Rachel's inspiration for this,
Give credit where credit's due.
and how sad it is not to have her, but we have her work in our collection now, which is another way to remember.
I think that in getting to know people, getting to know artists rather specifically, a dealer, if they have a good relationship with their artist, has the advantage of something. I remember talking to a masseuse, and I said, you know, you're in an interesting position. Somebody walks in, you've never seen them before, and you are, in a sense, more intimate with their body than the person they live with. And he said, yes, it's called unearned intimacy. And it's that you develop a quick intimacy because of the act that is happening. But a similar thing happens with dealers, because if you're just running a shop, it's a different kind of thing. If you're running a gallery and you're working with the evolution of that artist's career, you are dealing with their dreams, you're dealing with their disappointments, you're dealing with things that they may not speak to even their closest friends about. If they're going to get from step 1 to step 10 in the ladder, you're the person who's part of that. So your desires, your ambitions, a lot of things that might seem too egotistical to discuss in general conversation become an important part of the routine. And so, you know, my partner sitting there, my 45 years now, and we still live together. Very happily, I might add. Worked with Rick as much as I did. And I think for Rick, our gallery had an additional edge to it. First of all, we were the leading gallery in that field, and I don't say that as anything more than just an objective statement. But we were also two gay men, and so there's a certain sort of relax that happens. Because, I mean, we forget how tense the thing of being gay was at that time. It wasn't as bad as it was 20 years before, but it was still, you know, an obstacle course that you had to go through. So we had a lot of fun with him. We were as arrogant, as I said. But I wanted to mention this because the word's been bandied around a lot. Arrogance in his case was the fact that he was impatient. He didn't suffer fools very well. He abhorred ignorance. And can you imagine in his career how many stupid things he had to listen to? So there was a part of him that it just got about that again. But the difference is he did his research, he knew exactly, and so that forcefulness came from the fact of learning, researching, and knowing. Not everybody found him sort of ideal. I went to visit Betty Woodman, and bear in mind that he had another family, which is his contemporary family. Betty Woodman, Beatrice Word, Doyle Fry, Peter Volkers, a whole group of contemporary artists that he was friends with. And he once suggested to Betty Woodman that he do a swap. And artists will do this frequently for, I give you a piece, you take a piece, and no money exchanges hands. And so he went to see her in Boulder, and she brought some pieces and he chose one, and she said, well, you know, here's one for you. And he said, oh no. He said, your parts aren't worth very much. He said, I think that part that you are giving me is like $750. Mine is $6,000. So let's say 5 of your parts for me. Now that is so against the grain. I mean, the whole thing is no matter who you are, just one for one, done. And Betty, who was a bit of a marketing conniver herself, when I got there, was furious. She couldn't bring herself to refuse what he had asked. She was so angry. So, yes, did we? We felt we had a handle on him. We felt he was a closeness. We felt we understood. Probably only the timidity aspect, but it was very exciting for us.
That tip of the iceberg is definitely something that I feel all the time
Yes.
with him. You know, my capacity to learn and know is limited by the window that I have to research, bring the show together, have the show, do the programs, and then it's over.
Yeah.
It's very upsetting.
It's like
because,
speed dating.
Yeah, it is like speed dating, but more. More. And each layer that I pulled up, I found something else. I don't know if Rick would have liked me, or if he would have liked this that's happening right now. He probably would have been pretty angry about. So sorry, Rick. Don't come for me in my dreams.
Question here.
Yes.
I'm just really enjoying the conversation and the exhibition here. It's been quite something. Ever since I got exposed to Rick Dillingham, I've just craved a book to read about him with the likes of these academics who have anecdotal stories and such. And there's not enough, is there?
There's not.
Are
Not
you-
yet.
Are you ready to get busy?
I have written a paper about some of his end-of-life work, and I've been very lucky to present that at 2 conferences so far, and I have it out in the universe.
For publication.
Yes, but you send it, you gotta wait for someone to read it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. TBD. Yes.
If no one else has. Okay, you talked about the intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me something about the intimacy of not only making this object, but really the energy and intimacy of destroying, breaking it. What do you know about the breaking?
I don't know a lot about the breaking. I think like intimacy in this particular scenario are the things that we don't know. The things that happen in the process of making that we don't have access to, that's up here,
And that's what,
The physical act of breaking the pot was done with a special stick. I had this little, I guess it's a dowel, somewhere between a dowel and like a 1x1, and he would kneel on the ground and very carefully tap, 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 to break his pieces after they had been misfired.
the psychological stress.
Yeah, I think the physical labor, if you can imagine, like kneeling on the ground and kind of like hunched over this object and tapping and also listening. Anyone that has made pottery before, you can kind of hear when a crack is starting. Sometimes the pot will sing and it'll go ding, And other times it's like the sound of breaking a chocolate bar. You know, so there's these whispers that come from the body of the clay that, you know, that experience was solely Dillingham's. And I think that he took a lot of joy in those like private moments of making in his studio. Yeah. Ooh, there, and then there.
I'm just curious, number one, looking at the demographic, okay. What has been the response from young Native artists, young Native ceramic artists, and young people? We're of a very particular age bracket here, which I love you all, because I'm very, how about under 30? And I'm sure you've been getting those visitors. And
Yeah.
What's been the reaction to this man they probably knew nothing about?
That's I don't know. And that's actually what I was hoping we would get a couple of young folks. You're out there. I know you are. And that maybe this could be a good opportunity for a temperature check, especially with young indigenous potters. You know, we've reached out to a number of folks, and I have contemporaries that I work with, but I don't trust people that I know to tell me the truth about something that I've done. And some of that is like imposter syndrome, and some of it's legitimate.
I think that's Mark, I really think that's important. Sitting up here, I see the demographic, and Rick crossed all these lines and so forth. Do we miss Rick? Do I miss Rick? I guess the question. Absolutely. I think I knew a little bit and could talk to him. I know more now. I could talk to him, or he knows that much more, so I would still be trying to catch up with him. And open conversations about all these things. But I think one of the points of the demographic, and no younger Native people and so forth, no younger curators working in these materials any longer. Very few people in museums are working with historic or contemporary pottery from just a few years ago. Is that there's the pot's made, you know, and there is a language in that pot. It really does sing. But a potter, when he or she is polishing, they talk about the song that's created in making the pot. And Rick, you know, in that discussion about gluing back together ancestral pottery, was hearing that song in some fashion. And if you work with people in their homes, I'm sure you heard that song with them. So we're beginning to know more about the Native side from Native perspectives, including the Generations of Clay exhibition and so on. But there's this other thing about pottery which is represented by the demographic. And this is what is being, in my mind at least, it bothers me how much of that is being lost. About the collectors and dealers who made the world in which Pueblo pottery is exchanged in the non-Native world. And I have to worry about that, if I'm allowed to do so, that there's really nothing here in Santa Fe in terms of collecting that pottery, making those interviews. I mean, the exhibit was a great choice for that. There are people, thank you, Andrea, for donating lots of your sort of paperwork that goes with a few decades of working with potters. But that's very important. So there's this very intimate relationship the community has had with potters as dealers and collectors and scholars, curators. But there's very little, it's very difficult to find unless we start collecting it through oral histories and more exhibitions and just putting that work in place. As I started working on the early 20th century about pottery here in Santa Fe, there's really nothing in the books other than Kenneth Chapman writing in the margins of books. Mostly that's wrong, it didn't happen this way. And then this ephemera, which was every place. These invitations for traveling to department stores to show Zia pottery, for example, the World's Fairs and so forth. So what are we doing to avoid that now? I'm pointing to this space, because this is our space here, Mark, right? That we're not filling it. And that book about Rick would be several volumes, of course, because he was a several volumes type of person. But anyways, I think it's a good challenge for us to think about, to really do something about the void that is being lost unless we do more things like an exhibition and discussions like these. So thank you, Katie, for taking the initiative.
I think there's just quickly, there's a problem with history and with art history. It's a reductive process. Each year, there are fewer artists from the Renaissance that we sort of look at seriously, and of 10 years that we keep and fewer. It's all reductive as we try and sort of put it more in. A young artist walking in, seeing that exhibition without really doing more research, the statements are made there, but can't understand the warmth within which Rick functioned. So you could look at it academically and take a very hard cancel view of work and say, oh, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's the worst thing in the world, this is exploitation. But having spoken to the people he worked with, they loved him. Very often he was the first person who came and gave him real respect as an artist. The very first in their career. And when he used things from their culture, he did with them. So unfortunately, it's so difficult to take that tender human environment in which he and his collaborators work and bring it to now. Yeah, it then becomes part of art theory, and you say, well, theoretically, this is wrong, and the rest of it. But you not live in that community that he was so part of, which he so enriched. I think he gave so much confidence to the field.
He is also remembered in the communities where he was considered a family member.
Yeah.
So some of the potters I'm working with now have commented on him and their relationship with him, knowing him when they were young. You know, he visited often. As I say, it is remembered as one of the family, used in some contexts. Yeah. So, but your point about art history too. Art history is not social history. And so that's one of the things, the social history is the stuff that we're talking about, and that art history is a different kind of history, specifically not intended to be social history. But some of that collision I find to be problematic. But I will say too, maybe it was my own arrogance that, when I didn't know Rick well. I didn't have that long a time to maybe spend with him, but I was a young person sort of coming up in my field, and I was gonna show my whatever through my field work and whatever. I had to make my own mark, I guess, but I kind of regret not having known him well in that era, but I'm glad that I have gotten to know him much better now.
We are at 12:35. I know we have some dangling questions. Are you all are welcome to stay if you want. I feel like I need to take a vote. Are your brains and mouths all right so far?
Let's stick around if you want to.
Yeah, we'll stick around if you guys still have questions. Please feel free to pop up. Yes?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd really like to see more visual documentation of all the work that's done. Is there anything like that that exists?
We are working on that right now. Oh, yes, a physical documentation of other works that are not necessarily in the exhibition.
Yeah, just did someone keep a record of his earliest pieces?
Well, we are very lucky here at the museum to have Mr. Dillingham's archive. And so, Mr. Dillingham, I know, sorry, Juliet. Rick's archive is here. It's in the basement, and that does include his portfolio, his sales records, Polaroid slides, transparencies taken by the incredible Herbert Lotz, and yes, thank you, Herbert. So his work is well documented. And then in addition to the things that we have in the archive, we have also recently come into some 16mm film footage of his work. And there are a couple of reels of those films that are just still shots of his pots with really like beautiful theatrical lighting on them, and you can just see, you know, that singing, the pot singing in space, and it's just, oh, so good. We're writing a grant to get those films digitized. Hopefully they will be available in the next calendar year. It just takes time and money.
Is it possible to go into the archive?
Oh yeah, you can make an appointment with our librarian anytime. That's for all of you guys. If this is like kind of perked up your ears, like we have a wealth of resources, especially on Dillingham, on Rick's work here at the museum, and it's in the library. You can email our librarian. You can get our librarian's business card at the front desk. She's not here today, it's the weekend. But she would be beyond thrilled to show you what we have in the archive to pull things for you. Yes. And then we have one more question, and then another question, and then another question. So we'll go with you first.
I might need a bodyguard after asking this question. I first just want to disagree that art history is not social history. As an art history student at UNM, I think art is always political, especially when it pretends not to be. But I want to bring up, Katie, at the beginning of this discussion, you brought up the term appropriation, and that was pretty quickly dismissed by the panel, so I just want to revisit it and ask what exactly absolves Dillingham from being appropriative. Is it his personal relationships with the artist, and that they considered him family, even though that relationship was complicated by power dynamics of him being white, being not native, being a dealer, having the influence on the market and on artists that he did? Is it the fact that he himself as a gay man was also from a marginalized community? Is it because he did give credit to the artists that he was borrowing ideas from? Because in art history classes at UNM, when we talk about appropriation, the way we define it is someone from a dominant culture. Which even if Rick was a gay man, I think we can still say that he did represent a dominant culture in the US, taking ideas from another culture with impunity. In other words, in Rick's lived experience, he didn't deal with the problems and the oppression from society that Native people did, but he did, again, borrow those ideas with a different kind of impunity because of his positionality. So, yeah, I just want to revisit that question again and ask what absolves Rick from being appropriative?
I can start, if that's okay. Because I think I had a very similar reaction, and I share a lot of the same ideas that you just mentioned. You know, Dillingham was in a position of power as a white man. You know, physically he passed. I hear stories that once he opened his mouth, you knew he was very, very aggressively out of the closet. You know, does being from another marginalized community make it okay? And I don't know if you can absolve him of that personally. I just think that it just doesn't. It wouldn't hold up for him to make the work that he made now. You know, I think a lot of people would hold his feet to the fire on that, big time, and he would not like it. But I mean, I think, you know, because he's not here to defend himself, it's also like, at what point are we running around in circles, you know? But I do believe that toward the end of his life, he was tapping into his voice as an artist. And you can see in the exhibition, a lot of his end-of-life work is really kind of stepping into his next phase of making that was uniquely his own. You know, he had learned from elders a lot of things about firing. He had learned as a student worker how to reassemble pots in a way that they would be stable, that they would work, right? And and that these were all acquired skills from his time building these relationships and cultivating trust and cultivating kinship. So it is very, for me, it's very murky, but you know, today that would not stand. And so I do think it is important to say so, regardless of what those relationships were like in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Yeah, does that kind of answer your question? I feel like all it does is validate. But
well, and I want to just, you know, Bruce, thank you for your point about, you know, I didn't personally know Rick, and he was, as we all are, a product of the time that we're living in. And I think that's a question that gets asked a lot, especially in regard to appropriation, is that a good enough answer?
yeah,
Well, I think Rick did so many things in the Native community, and he worked with a lot of males who were trying to understand how their sexuality could be in the community and be part of the life, quiet or not quiet, and that's still spoken about all the time. Also, Rick's hand in just encouraging people. So I understand the word appropriation, and 10 years will be another word that's used in scholarship. But I think when you go into the communities and you talk in the communities and you really work with people, there's a different viewpoint. As a UNM PhD, okay, I understand you sit and you do your work in your office, you go to the library, maybe you talk to somebody and this and that. But it's different having a long-term relationship with communities. And you learn very differently that you're really there as a facilitator. That you take your privilege, whatever that privilege might be, and you open those doors for people, and you keep them open for people.
he did that.
And he did that. I think that's the point of the matter, that he really did that. And people still feel they're walking through that door, although there are several doors down the hallway from that. They're still walking through that door. And he gave people a certain courage to do things. And in Pueblo communities, you're pulled several directions. But as traditionally based people, traditionally overused, I apologize, but as people who are attached to the heritage of their communities, the continuity of their communities, they're pulled a certain direction, how to do things, and why to do things. And those things are discussed away from us as outsiders. And no matter how close you might become to people and families, there's still things that we are not privileged to know. So that's a pull. And then there's other pull about existing in a cash society and existing well in that, and having the things happen, having good relationships with the galleries and so on. I think the term unearned intimacy, and putting up with that of people who buy something of yours and suddenly they can hug you and do these other things. So I think Rick just opened this doorway and opened a conversation that is still in the marketplace and amongst potters and amongst collectors. And I think that's a big part of his legacy, is just working with people to back off and just hear what people are saying, to meet people in person. And he was, when I saw him with people, they were all grandma, and very genuine affection, from Lucy Lewis as an example of that, and the Lewis family. And if you work a long time with people, you can have some of that effect, and it's really quite extraordinary, the generosity in the community. So I think the appropriation label sits elsewhere from this conversation. I can see and understand how Rick looks like. He used it and so forth. There's a pottery exhibition at Gerald Peters. I forgot the name of the potter, of course. That's a Korean American potter. Have you seen that? Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And you know, we went and saw that pot. You know, it looks a little bit like corrugated. It looks a little bit like mid-19th century storage jars here in the Southwest, but they're not. It's just the form of using clay and what you do with clay and so on. And I think also my eye, I should say, is like, oh, it's Pueblo Pottery first. So everything is through a filter for me of Pueblo Pottery first. So it's hard for me to see other ceramicists at times. But I think Rick's work as a ceramicist is very, very distinctive. And other potters, like Diego, worked on that same gold, Diego Romero. In his MFA work at UCLA, he did gold to show the value of ancestral pottery to him, and he did a takeoff on Delftware. Again, the idea of communities of pottery. So he really worked back against those things. So I think, again, the courage that Rick has put into communities is still very much there. And I think we can appreciate that part of Rick.
I want to echo that. I think he respected the potters that he worked with, the family members, and they respected him. I don't think that there was a sense of exploitation, as you pointed out, in our earlier conversation. Co-creation was a trend in the art world. But I don't his work does affect me that way. Again, the potters who was family, they mourn his loss, they miss him, you know, as part of the family. So that indicates that there was mutual. He did acknowledge them. Seven families, both ways of acknowledging people, that these were. It was part of how his method of representing them was part of the way he used art world conventions. So it's part of how a canon formed in the late 20th century. Acknowledging potters as artists. Though that's according to not community criteria, but arbitral criteria, which where principally plays. But yeah, and I think this question of the intimacy is really significant because making is very intimate kind of work, and it really is it's a way of creating a social being, and an intimacy is very much a component of how these things are. Beings are all of energy aspirations, etc. In that work. And then we talk about voice. Voice is elicited once it emerges from the fire. If it is integral, it's a call and response. Being the pot, it responds with this voice. If it has a crack, it doesn't have that. But the voice also gives it the capacity to circulate in the world. And make these connections. One of the things, without that understanding where they're made, don't necessarily know that I'm speaking mostly It's an invitation to participate in that with the maker. And if you don't know that, you can't respond. You can't really establish the connection in a way that's seamless. Rick clearly had a singing relationship with that people that was close with, and I don't think his arrogance would have gone very far. If that's what I don't think that's another in those communities. I think that's a very indication of his respect to.
Jacob stepped in and said that you had contributed value to was appropriate. And that's a special thing. My difficulty with appropriation, the shrillness of companies is that these things begin with attention, but they end up being dogmas. So that the Lord is stated, so if you take that artist and how they do, what they do, how they do, how they behave, on a case-by-case basis. One appropriation could be very exploitative, very obviously gives nothing back, takes everything. And then in other cases, as with falls, what do you do as an artist? You come across native art. It inspires you more than anything else. Keeps you awake at night. Think green about but you do allow things to do things to someone else. I mean, if we took that to everything is
Wait, Andrea, you had a question.
procedure that you go through, the time that you stick that shovel into to get that point as the creation wishes and send it on its way. That part has touched on and I think Rick had understanding how to make fit the culture in those terms. And just as arrogant and native American, and they from what I could see, covered their mouths, they as being the visiting performer, and he reveled in that reputation.
I just want to add the whole concept of a book turning into a shopping center. We were not flooded with where we were. You found a book. You found 1978. Wow. If you use the money, use it. You wrote a century in the United States, 1970. Every collector's home had an old tag. Because that was all we had. Couldn't check out. You saw the same images over and over again. It's understanding that. And so I understood what it was. Now you can't quite do that.
Well, you have to search it out. If you're going to test it, you have to search it out. Now all you got to do is search it out.
You're going to be told. Top 10. I'm sure you'll be told. There's no extra information. There's no learning.
Well, you would walk into the gallery, you know, and look with their heart. I think that has always been a complicated aspect of pottery marketplace. I appreciate that. And even the religious side, ceremonial side of doing things is part of that heart. And I think in the end, I would suggest that Rick shared that heart. And that's it. And I totally agree. Just make all those potters. It doesn't matter. They really felt a kinship with some type. So again, they shared that heart. Pottery, deeply cared about it. Part of making community.
It is 1 o'clock. I know that there are still questions. I would like to ask perhaps that you reserve your questions. Maybe join us downstairs where there's snackies, coffee. If you're hungry, because it is 1 p.m. It's about lunchtime. And that's where we're headed.